All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Ring with FAMM. So excited to have you here with us today. We're going to have a great discussion about second chances. It's a term that gets used a lot, and I want to make it a little more specific. Last week, FAMM announced the Second Chances Agenda, which was a repackaging of some ideas that we've been working on for years in a way that we think gets at one of the toughest problems we have in this country, which is extreme sentencing. And the idea that our states and the federal government have lots of ways of throwing people away, but not a lot of mechanisms for giving them a second chance and seeing whether they need all the time they got originally. And so what went into the second chance agenda? Ideas like a second look law, which is laws at the state and federal level that direct courts to reconsider somebody's sentence after 10 or 15 years to see if the sentence is still appropriate, if the person has moved on, has been rehabilitated, or maybe our attitudes have changed and the punishment no longer makes sense. Compassionate release, which is something we've been pushing at the federal level. For people who, and by compassionate release, I mean it broadly. I mean sick, elderly, people have served long sentences. The public safety benefit of keeping them there is almost nothing, and yet the cost is high. And we know that there's not a lot of value in keeping people in, and we're losing resources that could be used to keep us safer. And then clemency, which has been around since the beginning of time, and is where the governors and the president can use their authority to shorten sentences, to pardon people, to take away their records, to allow them again to have a second chance and get back on their feet. We saw that in the Obama administration. FAMM and other organizations, including the ACLU, worked with the Obama administration on a clemency project that wound up with over 1,800 people getting their sentences commuted, including several hundred lifers who did not need to die in prison. And so that was a worthwhile effort. But we don't have enough of those mechanisms in place. And there are other mechanisms. For instance, we pass a lot of reforms across the states, but we don't always make them retroactive. So we tell stories about people who are getting hammered with long sentences. We use those stories to change the law, but then lawmakers, scared of somebody getting out and doing something wrong, don't make those reforms retroactive. We need to make all of our reforms retroactive. We could fix parole reform. We could reform parole systems in the states that have it so that more people get an opportunity for a second chance. And then there's things that prosecutors can do. You're seeing some of the progressive prosecutors around the country begin to revisit sentences through whatever authority they have. They're setting up sentencing integrity units where they're revisiting sentences where maybe the legislature didn't make a reform retroactive, and they're going back in and looking at them. And so we wanted to tackle this big problem, and we've been talking about these ideas for a while and wanted to put it in a way that made sense to people, which is that we say this is a nation of second chances, but we're really slow to grant them. Why now? Well, we are not only approaching an important presidential election, but we have just seen COVID-19 ravage our prisons and jails, killing over 1,000 people, many of whom did not have a life sentence, but yet who will not go home to their loved ones because of this disease. And because we've seen the stubborn legacy of racial discrimination elicit some of the biggest protests in this nation's history. And so we need an agenda and a movement that will match this moment. And we think that we're going to have to tackle some of the bigger problems in our system. And while we will continue to work on prison reform, low-level mandatory sentencing reform, and the other issues we've tackled, we think we have to start changing the narrative about long sentences, the people who are serving them, and the motivation behind those laws. And so we couldn't have a better panel to discuss this. I'll briefly mention them, and then I'm going to call on them. And then, as always, halfway through, we'll take your questions. But we're joined by Amy Fettig of the Sentencing Project, Executive Director, is that right? Is that your title? April Frazier Camara from the Black Public Defender Association, and Dylan Hayre from the ACLU. And they all have a specific purpose for being here because they're all contributing to this space and to these goals. And I'm going to start with Amy because the Sentencing Project, in my mind, over the last several years, has done incredible work on tackling long sentences through your campaign to end life sentences and sort of no sentences, maximum sentences of 20 years. But can you talk a bit about why Sentencing Project is doing that? And what people need to know about the utility of these long sentences. And thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. And let me also say that I am thrilled that FAMM is taking on second look, because this is absolutely critical. And for some reason, the Sentencing Project is focusing on extreme sentencing because we want to end mass incarceration in this country. And we know, looking at the data, state by state, community by community, and nationwide, that we cannot end mass incarceration unless we deal with extreme sentencing in the United States. We've tended to forget that not only have we put more people behind bars than any other country in the world, and by now many people are familiar with we have 5% of the world's population, but the vast majority of people behind bars. What we don't hear so much, but what is equally true, is that we also have more people serving life sentences than any other nation on the planet. About 80% of the people who are serving life sentences are actually in the United States. And so we are a global outlier. And that should cause us to think, do we just have the worst people in the world? Or is something else going on? And I want to suggest to everybody who is watching this that something else is going on. And that something else was the buildup of mass incarceration, in which we locked up more people, but we locked them up for longer and longer sentences, or extreme sentences. And in fact, in a way that we didn't do in our history. This extreme sentencing, where we have more people in prison today than we actually had in our entire prison population in 1970, that's unusual in our history. We didn't used to have such extreme sentencing, but part of mass incarceration was putting people away for very long periods of time and never giving them an option to parole out or to have a second chance. And that's changing now. And it's very, very important, because one of the things that we've learned in these last 40 years of mass incarceration is that locking people up for longer and longer periods of time simply doesn't work. There is no public safety benefit for the billions of dollars that we spend incarcerating people for decades and decades and decades. What the research shows us again and again is that people age out of crime. They very, very rarely commit crimes, especially serious crimes, after a young age, basically the mid-20s. And indeed, what we also know is that extreme sentencing is not a deterrent for criminal behavior. Nobody thinks, oh my goodness, I'm only going to get 10 years if I commit this robbery. I'll do it, as opposed to if they got 25 years. That is not how crime works. We know that certainty actually is the greater deterrent. Extreme sentencing, it's just not a rational public safety strategy. So what we've done over the years is build this enormous criminal justice system that sucks up so many public resources for very little public safety benefit, and indeed impacts communities negatively around the country, taking resources, taking people out of our communities who really can and should have a second chance.
Well, thanks for that. And again, thanks for being here. April, I want to turn to you. As I mentioned to you, that the Black Public Defender Association released some recommendations about reducing incarceration, and I think specifically with an eye towards reducing the racial disparities we have in the system. Can you talk a little bit about those recommendations and why you felt now was a time to address those? Is there something in this moment, or was this something that was coming anyway? And thanks for joining us.
No, thank you for having us. So we were really, Kevin, in your introductory remarks, you talked about the role of progressive prosecutors and dealing with this issue of mass incarceration and second look. Our goal at the Black Public Defender Association is to talk about the role of defenders, and specifically the role of Black defenders in highlighting this intersection between the work that we do every day in courtrooms with the communities that we live in, right? And so what our goal was behind the report was really to highlight through COVID-19, which created the perfect storm, to show the intersection of historic racial inequities in the criminal legal system. And so what we found through COVID-19 is that the responses to what was happening to clients in the courtroom and also and institutions did not have a racially responsive strategy. And I want to be very clear about what our goal is. When we talk about these issues around second look and second chances and COVID-19 responses, if we are not centering those conversations on race, then we are doing harm to Black communities and communities of color. Because I think the starting point is to talk about who is locked up for very long sentences. And so in our report, we highlight the fact that over 50% of people who are serving life sentences or virtual life sentences are African American. And I think that's very important for us to talk about, because when we talk about this moment, we are in a moment where there is an overwhelming majority of Americans who feel strongly that our criminal legal system needs to be reformed. But I think we have to first, in our moment of anticipation around reform, we have to talk about who makes up the criminal legal system and why. We have to talk about the root of race and how it's built into the criminal legal system, and perhaps even take a look at why is it half of people in serving life sentences are Black. And I think that allows us to open up this conversation around some very difficult issues around race and the role that it plays in sentencing and the role that it plays in the criminal legal system. So when we look at this issue of second look, we see it as a racial equity issue, because it gives us an opportunity to reopen a chapter in American history that has disproportionately harmed Brown and Black communities. So it's actually an opportunity for us to restore beliefs in justice. And we understand from research that there is a deep divide between whether communities of color have faith in the legal system versus white communities. And so second look gives us an opportunity to actually go back and evaluate some of those policies. And I also want to talk about, we raised the issue of the need to have a critical conversation about the term violent and the exclusion of people who are labeled as violent offenders. We think it is very necessary. While it's great for us to put a focus on nonviolent offenses, we have to do the very hard work to talk about the use of labels can be very harmful. And what we want to do is restore the humanity behind, not to just put a label on a person and exclude them from opportunities for a second look or opportunities for rehabilitation, but for you to see the full person and for you to understand the full story and not allow a label such as violent to exclude people from those considerations. And then finally, I'm just going to say how important it is. One of our core recommendations is around racial impact statements. And Amy, you can appreciate this actually came from the Sentencing Project many years ago, and it's been adopted by jurisdictions. And it's really centered around the fact that we cannot establish new laws or reform without looking at the racial impact that it will have on communities. So we're really excited, but we're excited to really center the conversation where we think is very much needed, which is a conversation about race. Because many of you know, we can be very effective at achieving reforms, but if we don't address the underlying issue, we may find ourselves in the same space 20 or 30 years later, and maybe with a different population that's been overly targeted. But the complicated issue of race has to be centered in conversations around second look and other reforms in the system. So BPDA is happy to begin to have the conversation and support the conversation in the criminal reform space.
Great. I've already got 1,000 questions, but I got to go to Dylan. Dylan, just before we were launching, ACLU launched I think it's National Redemption Project. And the goal is focus on clemency. I know you work on all these other issues as well, but can you talk about what that project is about, why you started it, and what its goals are?
Sure, and thank you, Kevin. It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you, Amy and April, for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. Yeah, on August 5th of this year, the ACLU launched a national campaign, the Redemption Campaign, Embracing Clemency. This is, as you said, Kevin, a national effort to liberate 50,000 people from state prisons over the next 5 years through the use of categorical commutations. Governors using their powers of clemency in broad, new, transformational ways to get people out of state prisons. And the reality is a lot of this onus does fall on governors, right? Of the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in this country, as everyone here knows, 1.3 million of those folks are in state prisons. So why we did this is sort of threefold, right? Number one is it's very clear that while we have seen success over the last few years in advocating for progressive prosecutors to make better policies, while we've seen success advocating for justice reform through legislative action, through ballot initiative, governors have largely gone unscathed and have not been held accountable the way they need to be for the power they have, right? And so we want to shift the narrative and shift the framework within which governors operate so that more and more people recognize that governors have this power and should be using this power, right? We also know, and as April and Amy were pointing out a minute ago, this is absolutely a fight for racial justice and relatedly for economic justice, right? The racial disparities in state prison systems across sentences are absolutely rampant and have been there for a long time and are a product of the foundations upon which the system was built, right? And so this is not a situation where we can tinker around the edges and hope that just by reforming things here and there, we get enough Black and brown folks out of prison just because we're trying our best in other places. We have to have a concentrated effort that looks to the people who are stuck in prisons on these excessively long, abhorrent sentences. Something I know, Kevin, that is a big focus of this push from FAMM and why I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation. Look at those folks and figure out what we can do to create avenues to timely, expedient release. And commutation is perhaps, the most robust way to do that in terms of not requiring legislative action, not needing timetables, not needing, much of anything. Even in states where there is a process through which clemencies and commutations have to go, governors have the power to demand the initiation of that process, right? It's absolutely, like I said, to a fight for economic justice. States spend $43 billion a year in their prisons at a time when states are clamoring to close budget gaps brought on by the pandemic, at a time when people are taking to the streets more than ever before to demand that we pull money out of the criminal legal system and put it back into communities that have been most impacted and harmed. Freeing people from state prison allows us to then think about what it would mean to close those facilities, to divest from that system a little bit here and there, to figure out where we can better allocate resources that we're currently wasting on state prisons across the country. So governors, again, with the authority to do this, should be pushed to do this and should be pushed to do it, a lot more often than they are. And that's really the third goal of the campaign here, right? Where we do see clemency used, it's often used as an individual grant of mercy to a few lucky people, typically at the end of a governor's term. This president, I will say, has, I think, politicized this issue more than most by using it throughout his term as a way, I would say, to sort of score points or to insert himself into a narrative. But governors who are decrying the use of clemency at the national level, should be doing that same thing every single day and should have done that same thing throughout this pandemic to free people from state prisons. This cannot be something that happens at the end of a term. This needs to be something that a governor does on day one. No other actor in the criminal legal system has the power to correct the brutal excesses and gross injustices of the criminal legal system the way a governor does. We hear every day through this work from judges, prosecutors, from defenders who are in many ways helpless and powerless to really go into state prisons and get people out in a very broad way. Even legislation, it's very rarely made retroactive. It very rarely applies back to the people who are still trapped in prisons. Governors are the people who have the ability to change that and to address it and to confront it. So the goal here is to really, again, build some political will, normalize this process, and make this an issue, frankly, that becomes an electability issue. If people across this country want to run for governor in the years ahead, then we want to get to a point where they are having to answer questions about how soon they will commute sentences and how many thousands of sentences they will commute. That should be an expectation that people have of their governors, the way we have, like I said, developed that expectation around prosecutors in a lot of parts of this country. You know, we absolutely want to build on and strengthen the foundations that have been laid in this work by folks like you, Kevin, and others on this call, and others who are listening today, I'm sure. Clemency, as you said, is a longstanding American tradition. There's no reason that people should see this as sort of a newfangled idea or some concept that the ACLU or others are sort of inventing. We're simply pointing to the fact that this power has existed and is not being used and needs to be used. We want to humanize people through this work, right? This work will center a lot on thoughtful and meaningful storytelling, right? Centering the expertise, the wisdom, the experience of people who have been incarcerated, people who are incarcerated, people who have welcomed their loved ones home through commutations. As you said, Kevin, we have a great example from 2014 of a large group of folks who were able to receive commutation, even where that commutation is still a few years away. That's a lot of people whose stories should be told every single day as a way to kind of highlight not just their humanity, but the inhumanity of the system as a whole. And frankly, the overarching goal on top of all of this is to replace the architecture of mass incarceration with a road to redemption, right? This is an opportunity to offer redemption, not just to individuals who are incarcerated, but frankly, to all of us in the public who've been bystanders as the system has grown and grown more corrosive and corrupt over the last several decades. All of us on this call have fought like hell to push back on this system. But this country, I think, has allowed this system to grow in a way that it should never have grown. And now it's a chance to go back and correct some of the mistakes we've made. And finally, I'll just end on this. We also want to make sure that governors are able to redeem the acts of their predecessors, right? Every single law that imprisons people in state prisons was the product of a governor's signature. With that same stroke of a pen, governors can begin to let people go home, to free them, to offer them some opportunity at hope and healing. And we look forward to seeing a lot of that in the years ahead.
Thanks for that. We're already getting questions in, and I hate easy questions. And since I have experts here, I'm gonna ask the hard ones right away, which is this. We all recognize that this is a heavier lift, that trying to get people out from the long sentences, and it's not necessarily because of race, that's part of it. And we know the disparity in the longer sentences and who's serving life sentences and the rest. But I think your average person, I can channel my aunt, who is probably hopefully not watching, will say, it's about what they did. That's what they're scared of, right? So when we've worked on clemency in the past with governors, and we say, this person has served long enough time, 20, 30 years, the hiccup is, well, this person committed a serious violent crime, something that people would objectively agree was serious and used violence. And that's the fear, right? I mean, we sort of, humans were scared of that element of it. And so how do we address that concern, which is that the number one thing people say they want of the justice system is public safety. So April, I'm gonna start with you, because I know the disparities exist, and I know we wanna get at that. But the thing that people are gonna respond with is, I'm less worried about what color they are than what they did, and am I now at risk somehow from, my family at risk? So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So I think one of the tragedies of the criminal legal system is the dehumanization of the people who are incarcerated, who are behind bars. And what I find with our work is that when you tell the human story and you are able to share the fact that a really good person could have made a really bad decision, right? And so we see that playing out in the reforms around juvenile life without parole sentences. How I would judge you as a 16-year-old who committed a crime and who you are now at the age of 36 is completely different. And I think it's our role as advocates to be able to share those stories and to humanize the many people. I'm sure all of you all know it's amazing, great people who are behind bars right now. That's what we need to lead with. The fact that these are at National Legal Aid, we have an art auction that's connected to our dinner. All the art is done by people who are incarcerated, amazing, talented people who have gifts to share with the world. So how I would frame it, Kevin, is to not talk about fear, but to really talk to the community about this amazing possibility and these amazing talents that people have to share with the world if they are given a second chance. And I do have to push back a little bit about it not being about race, because when we look at the data and the science around implicit bias and who we fear, we know you could have the same great person with the same character, but research shows that people with darker skin, wider noses, more Afrocentric features, implicitly, this is in our minds, this is just the way our minds are wired, that implicitly people have a unconscious fear, which is not based on facts, but it is just a way of our brain being wired. So oftentimes it's interesting to see what images are shown of people, and we see the data on race about the person who is accused of the same offense who's white in the image that's put out versus the person of color who's in a jumpsuit, and that's the public image to their clemency campaign, right? So race plays a role in everything. And I just want to be, clear about that, even if it's not conscious. Often 80% of what we do around race is unconscious, and it plays a role.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And it's one I've made too, that I don't think we have had one federal commutation in this administration of a Black male who is alive. And I know that we have governors, when they reach out to us for help, they want to focus on women. And I don't think I think there's a reason for that. We do perceive people differently as who's more dangerous, and Black men are the culture's shape of who's a criminal. I agree with all of that. I do think, though, that it's fair for people to say, Amy, well, you did something really bad. And I believe that you're no longer a threat. But the victim, they don't get a second chance, and their family doesn't get a second chance. And so I know not all victims think the same thing, but how do we address that harm? How does society say, you can get your pound of flesh, we can make you whole, without just locking somebody up and throwing away the key?
Yeah, and I think that no one is talking about not holding people accountable for the bad things they do. I do always like to hearken back to Pat Nolan from when he was at Prison Fellowship, reminding folks that no one is solely defined by the worst thing they ever did, and who amongst us would want to be so judged. Similar to what April said, that people do grow and they do change, and in small fits and starts around the country, communities and activists are looking for a different way of dealing with serious acts of crime through restorative justice, where it becomes both the perpetrator and the individual who's been impacted, and the community as well, can come together and look for different solutions than just locking somebody up for 50 years or 40 years or 2 decades. Because ultimately that robs the community of a human resource, and it also, of course, costs the community an enormous amount. So looking for alternative ways to actually deal with serious issues. I mean, no one is saying we don't have some violence in this society. What we are saying is that there is probably a better way of dealing with it than locking people up for 40, 50 or years or more, and never giving them a second chance to come back and transform themselves. I mean, ideally, our correction system is supposed to be about rehabilitation. Now, unfortunately, because we've warehoused people in horrendous conditions, overcrowded, not giving them programming, not giving them an opportunity to get education or job skills, we've undermined the purpose of our correction system, which generally has been to rehabilitate and to incapacitate. So that it is very true that some of these institutions make people worse off. So we have to rethink the way we're dealing with violence, with serious acts, and I think that our change in the way we've dealt with drug offenses was a really good model. It used to be entirely through the criminal justice system. And we still have people serving life imprisonment in this country for drug crimes. They're not the majority, but they're about 17,000 people. That's a lot of people. But nonetheless, we've changed our way of looking at drug abuse. We've seen it as a public health, addiction as a public health issue. We know actually that looking at a public health frame at drug addiction and drug use is more useful, and it's more helpful, and it invests more in the community. We should do the same thing with violence. Treat it as a public health issue, address it at the community level, address it through prevention, rather than on the back end when somebody's been harmed. But right now, we spend so many of our resources in the criminal justice system, in prisons and jails, that there's nothing left, or we make those choices. What we should be doing is using those resources to invest in our community rather than to take people away from our community and deprive us of what good that they could do.
Yeah, I wanted to just say, I mean, to show you how big a challenge this is, even working on federal compassionate release as we have, for years, but more so during COVID, you have people who are in walkers or who have dementia, who committed offenses 20, 30 years ago, who are no threat to the public safety, and judges and prosecutors still saying to let them out would diminish the severity or minimize the severity of the harm they caused, right? Or that they're still a public safety risk. And so there is a change that has to happen. You guys are talking about looking at the humanity of people and stuff. We do have a ways to go there, because I think the impulse is there's a lot of punitiveness in this country. I just think, I mean, when you were saying like we're an outlier compared to the rest of the countries, it's because look at how much we use life sentences and sentences like that. I just want to mention, I'm going to come to you, Dylan, but we've already gotten some questions, which I'll come to. A lot of people are already asking how they can get involved. I'm going to selfishly say that to get involved with our Second Chances agenda for now, just text chances is the word, to 21333. Chances to 2133. And the reason we're having people start with signing the petition so we can figure out where you are is because a lot of legislatures aren't in session yet. And the goal of this campaign is really to get these ideas introduced when they come back. So we want to build support in all these communities so that when we come back, we can lean on policymakers in these states to say, hey, we want clemency, we want a compassionate release. One thing that has become crystal clear during COVID is that whereas the federal government has been able to get over 1,400 people out through compassionate release, the states have failed miserably because they don't even have mechanisms to get people out. And then you have governors who are failing. So we need to create those mechanisms, but for now, we just want to get people supporting this notion and talking about it as the election approaches. Dylan, one of the questions we had, and I think this is a challenge, is one thing you mentioned is that governors can sort of get around the process a little bit. You don't have to go to the legislature. They can make this decision. What we've seen in COVID is the converse, where you have governors who say, I'm not letting anybody out. I don't care how bad it is. I'm not letting COVID become an excuse. A global pandemic becomes an excuse, they say, for letting people out of harm's way. And so what if you're under the thumb of, sort of political leaders who aren't with you? How do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to say there. One thing we did see throughout this pandemic is a pretty drastic reduction in jail populations across the country. But we did not see, to your point, Kevin, any level of commensurate reduction in state prison populations. And we saw a lot of governors who actually, to your point, went the exact opposite way. And certain governors who shall remain nameless, delivered some doozies of talking points in terms of, I'm not going to let dangerous criminals out on the streets in this pandemic and this, that, and the other. So a couple of things. Number one, I think one of the reasons we saw drastic reductions in jail populations is because for the last 10, 15, 20 years, grassroots advocates, impacted communities have normalized the idea of jail reductions, right? Through bail reform, through prosecutorial reform, through sentencing reform on the front end, right? There's been a real effort behind getting those parts of the justice reform movement in place and making them sort of accessible and palpable and putting them into action in different states across the country. So system actors at that part of the system had some examples. They had places they could look, and they already saw proof of concept that they could do this without jeopardizing public safety, without undermining their own integrity of their department or of the system. There has not been, a commensurate sort of awakening amongst governors in this country where the process of clemency and prison releases has been similarly normalized. there's any lesson to be learned from COVID in terms of how it applies to this work, I think that's it right there, right? Governors never felt the pressure to use their commutation authority in a way that they absolutely should feel that pressure, right? They have never sort of been held accountable for not using it in a way that they should. And frankly, because, I think one of the reasons, Kevin, and this goes to the conversation you were just having with April and Amy, is that there's a real sense of sort of wiping your hands at a certain point in the system when it comes to people who are in prison, right? There's this false notion that once someone goes through the pretrial stages, through the trial, through the sentencing, that's it, right? They don't need to be looked back on. They don't need to be revisited. They don't even need to be seen as a human being anymore in a lot of places. And that is so wrong and so vile and so corrosive, right? So, we want to be able to, we need to shift the narrative a little bit here and say, no, people who are in prison absolutely need to continue to be seen and heard and lifted up. And also, I think there's a bit of word association that comes into play with this stuff, Kevin, right? Like, incarceration does not equal public safety. Incarceration does not equal accountability. I know that a lot of people think it does because they have been told that it does, because frankly, we have been unwilling, or in many cases, unable to craft solutions that would replace incarceration, right? And I'd say it's largely on the willing side of things. So this idea that, to let someone out of prison in the midst of a pandemic or otherwise would undermine the integrity of the sentence, or would undermine the necessity of the sentence. What undermines the integrity of the system is someone sitting in prison for 30 or 40 years with no hope, with no access to healing, with no opportunities to rebuild their lives. And, the fact is most people who are in prison are going to come home at some point anyway, right? All you're doing by forcing people to sit there and wait without access to hope or programs or opportunity, any of that, is just diminishing their existence more and more and more. Yes, people make mistakes, but to Amy's point, no one is saying people should not be held accountable for the mistakes they made. Incarceration is not an accountability mechanism. We have fooled ourselves into thinking it is, but it never has been effective at that, and it will not be effective at that. So I hear you, and I'm not yelling at you, Kevin, but it is like, it's really, it is. I mean, we're all frustrated by this, by what we've seen, but I think the reality is that governors have felt safe for far too long and don't feel like they have a responsibility to get people out of prison, when the reality is they have a responsibility, because the responsibility they have derives from the power they have.
April, you want to add something?
No, I think Dylan made a really good point about the success we've seen with the pretrial justice movement, and how rooted it is in community-led coalitions. So what we've been able to see on the front end of the system is an investment in community-based resources, right? So the District of Columbia is a prime example. Have very low pretrial incarceration rates because there are community-based resources where people can go for support, services, monitoring that is available. The return to court rate, the number of people who get rearrested, very low. But those are institutions and systems that have been invested in. And we need to see the same level of investment on the back end as we advocate for second chance and clemency. The question is, what supports are going to be available to people when they come home after serving 20 and 30 years? In many communities, it's little to none. So you can embolden opponents to make the argument that it's safer to keep them inside, because there has been no investment in the communities to build structures for them to succeed. So, and we talked about it in our report, the BPDA report, about when you talk about decarceration, there also has to be a conversation about transferring those resources back into directly impacted communities to build that support. Because people have to be supported as they come back home in order not to create that narrative that the reforms don't work. So release people, but also release them with the appropriate support, and it's critical.
Yeah, I mean, especially all these people coming home in the middle of a pandemic, and then they couldn't go get their IDs because the government offices were closed. I mean, it's, and then they were supposed to find a job. So it's been hard. I want to ask a question that came in from a viewer. And I'm gonna ask you, April, do you believe that those who have the opportunity while incarcerated to receive education and or volunteer and have taken advantage of that, does that make a difference? What do you think about sort of in-prison programming and education?
Absolutely. So research shows one of the number one investments that you can make in a person's ability to come home, successfully transition back in the community, and not have future contacts with the system is education. So we have great data to show that people who are able to obtain education while incarcerated, specifically, even when you look at recidivism rates from associate degrees up to bachelor's and postgraduates, it's almost minimal to none. Education is key. And I do want to say, and we're just not talking about college degrees, but even training, but to make sure that those vocational training programs are linked back to jobs that's in the communities that people are returning home to. I can attest to the fact that when I was a public defender, we fought and advocated for the Bureau of Prisons to have vocational training related to people returning back home to Washington, D.C. The job market has radically changed. So the typical jobs or vocations that you could train someone for, they no longer exist. So the question is, are we training people on green jobs, how to install solar panels, how to come back home to communities and do fiber optic cables? I'm talking about livable wage jobs that we know people can come home and take care of their families. So the connection to education while you're incarcerated, vocational training, and your ability to succeed when you come home, the data cannot be questioned. There's a direct link.
Amy, I got a question for you. Well, I'm going to say two things. One is FAMM supports the restoration of Pell Grants in prisons. We do support in-prison programming. And I do think it can help. I also think, you could treat people with dignity and keep them safe and feed them well and, give them outlets for whatever creativity they have. And that would help too, because, there's just a certain period of time, even some of the people I serve with just said, I just needed to grow up. So part of this is just a maturation process. And we know that from even, biology and brain science now, that, not being idle is a good thing. But I want to ask you, because April's point and the one that's asked raises the question of, then do we invest in prisons? I'm at this weird point where we want a smaller prison population, but people on the outside also realize that their prisons are short-staffed, so that they're more dangerous. There are fewer programming options because you don't have the infrastructure there. And so it's this weird thing of like, yeah, we want to do away with these. In the short term, we're starving prisons in some ways. And so COVID was another thing that exposed that, because you had lots of officers quarantining them, and then no one was there to even serve food, and people were getting worse meals. I mean, so it was like this weird thing where, is starving the beast while you're still trying to rehabilitate, does that work? I mean, so how do you wrestle with those two things? Like, shrink the system, yes, but in the meantime, aren't there some things we want the system to do that it's not doing?
Well, absolutely. And the answer is never you focus on one piece, because it is a system. So you have to see it as a system. And the reality is we got 2 million people in prison right now, and many of those institutions are a walking human rights violation. We're actually putting people's lives at risk. As you mentioned at the beginning, 1,000 people have lost their lives, largely preventable deaths, because our systems are so overloaded, they're so incompetent that they can't handle a public health crisis. And COVID, the pandemic, has really exposed the problems in our prisons to the public in a way that it had not been in a generation, even though that stuff has been going on forever. So what I would say is, what we need to focus on is getting that population down, because we simply have so many people in these institutions that they can't even do a good job. We need to decarcerate, and we know through jail right sizing, that it is actually possible that we hold people in prison for too long, for too little. That there's no reason, no public safety justification for the enormity of our prison population. So we do have to do that. But at the same time, we need to hold our prison administrators and our corrections staff accountable for treating people with humanity and dignity, and for being honest about what resources it takes to actually run a humane prison. No other country in the world has as many people incarcerated, but most of them actually spend way more per prisoner because they only use it in the most extreme circumstances. I mean, prisons should be something that you only use at the at the very extreme end of the punishment paradigm. We use it as our first, our option of first and last resort. We should be using it as little as possible, only for people who are a clear public safety threat. And then we actually know, as April pointed out, we actually know strategies that work to rehabilitate people. What we don't do in this country is actually use them consistently. We've got research, we've got the fact-based evidence. Unfortunately, the criminal justice system has too infrequently actually made its policy and practice based on what the research tells us. It's time to change that.
Well, I'm going to just issue a challenge here to those who are watching and to all of us, which is, I always say that if the politicians are listening to us, then they're not getting the message. We're not being loud enough, because if they want to get reelected and we are right that the public wants a different system, then somehow something's being lost in translation here, because they should be doing these things. And so I do think the challenge is, or the burden is on us. That's why we're trying to get, educate around this topic and these tougher issues, is because, I do think largely politicians are self-interested. They want to get reelected. And so there's something that's keeping them from voting in ways to reduce sentences. And, I don't buy that it's private prisons and all that sort of stuff. I think they think it's still a problem electorally. So how do you get around that? And by the way, Dylan, the question came in, will our local state ACLU office be working on the second chance agenda as well? That has to be a yes. I know you guys already support all these ideas.
Yeah.
But so how do we get the public involved, right? Because we always say that's the army. I mean, these are the voters. And by the way, I should say, there's elections coming up.
Yeah.
You have to reach out. You have to ask people. You cannot, you have to contact your lawmakers and say, I care about criminal justice reform and I'm voting, and then mean it. Because otherwise, why listen to us?
Yeah, I think, one of the first things that we have to do as advocates, that we have tried to do, that we need to continue to do, is to fight back against the othering of people and the separation of people who are incarcerated or impacted by the system. Because when it comes down to crunch time, I mean, one of the truisms that you hear all the time when you work on campaigns is that no campaign in this country should ever do a public opinion poll, because every public opinion poll says the same thing: jobs, education, healthcare. That's what people care about, right? That's what people talk about at their kitchen tables. That's what's going to move them, right? And one of the reasons it becomes sort of easy to talk about criminal justice reform, but then easy to forget it, is because you are always talking about someone else, right? You are always talking as a voter about someone else's problem, about someone else's family, frankly, about someone else's community, without recognizing two things. Number one is, more likely than not, mass incarceration is affecting you and your community as well. You may not see it all the time. You may not feel it every day, but it is there. The tentacles of the system reach out across this country. And if you haven't been caught in the system yet, statistically, it's probably because you're more lucky than good, right? It's about the decisions the system makes in terms of who it'll impact, not the decisions you make in large part, right? That's number one. And number two is, and this goes to exactly what April was saying a while ago about community investment. One of the reasons we're having a hard time funding those things, jobs in communities, education in all communities, healthcare in communities, is because we spend $43 billion a year on state prisons. We spend $80 billion a year on the system as a whole across this country. For every year politicians to get up and decry the fact that we don't have balanced budgets, or that we need to find other ways to invest in resources and people, I could write you an $80 billion check right now if you want to bring the money out of the system and put it elsewhere. Now, I know we're not going to get from 80 to 0, right? I'm being a little hyperbolic there, but to make a point, the idea is that we so often frame this as hey, there's folks who are incarcerated, I care about them. But then the sort of political retort is, well, what can I do for you? And it sort of becomes a very singular focused conversation on the person. And you tend to very quickly forget those other folks. So we need to sort of flip that, right? We need to continue to hold politicians accountable to the financial damage they're doing by allowing the system to go on. And also we need to think, I think, critically, frankly, about the stories that we are telling. And I say this as someone who I hope works very hard to tell people stories when they are incarcerated and when they're leaving incarceration. The reality is that this system, so many parts of this system set you up to fail, and we're surprised when people succeed. We need to flip that completely on its head. The system should be setting people up to succeed, and when people do falter and need extra support, those should be the exceptions, right? But what's happening now is that we tend to look for the exceptions in those successful people as kind of the heroes in this story, right? Someone who made it out of jail after so long, or prison, or who beat a charge and, you know, with a good public defender. And those stories are so often told as something that person did, right? Like, we just need more people to do what that person did. More people need to take individual action, or more people need to sort of, you know, educate themselves while they're in prison, or more people need to kind of apply for commutations or clemency. When the reality is the system has an obligation to sort of, you know, remove the barriers that people are confronting. The system has an obligation to not put people in the holes that they're in. And allowing the system to sort of, you know, to not hold the system accountable for the harm it's causing, I think is a huge oversight right now in sort of the work we're doing. And again, it's not the fault of anyone here, or frankly, anyone listening probably, right? I think everyone who's watching this probably understands this stuff and gets it, but we need to make politicians hear that message, right? We need to make politicians understand the fact that this is not incumbent upon the individuals who are incarcerated and impacted to end their incarceration and to relieve themselves of that impact. It's incumbent upon the system to stop doing the harm it's doing in those people's lives and in those people's families. And again, to Amy's point, right, this is not a conversation about accountability or integrity. This is not a conversation about minimizing the risk you have as a politician or system actor, right? The shadow of the Willie Horton ad continues to be cast over many parts of this country. This should be a conversation about what we have done to people for 40 or 50 or 60 years in this country, what we have done to communities, and frankly, what the system is designed to do on a daily basis. That should be the conversation we're having with politicians. And for any politician who refuses to acknowledge their role in that by virtue of the power they have, for any politician who refuses to see that the money being wasted there could go elsewhere, those politicians need to be reminded that they're essentially complicit in the maintenance of a harmful system. And I hope that that is the message that gets across to folks in the months and years ahead. And we've already seen it in some places, but we need to continue, to your point, Kevin, banging the drum on that every single day.
Yeah, I'm humbled by the fact that if you were going to choose the person you did not want to be, based strictly on criminal justice platforms, the person you did not want to be the Republican nominee in 2016, it would have been Donald Trump. And if my Twitter is to be believed, the two people you least wanted to be the nominee on the Democratic side, based on their criminal justice histories, are both now the vice president and presidential nominees. So obviously people have other issues that they're voting on, because these people who have records that are at best mixed on these issues, you know, still win because people do have other issues that they care about. So I also think that cautions us against putting all of our hope in federal lawmakers, that a lot of these decisions are made at the state and local level where people can engage and make more of a difference. I think that's why you're seeing these prosecutor races turn out differently. I'm going to ask each of you to take a couple minutes to share something we didn't get to, because we're wrapping up. And any points you want. I just want to say again, thanks so much for all the work you do and for, you know, sharing your wisdom with us. Amy, do you want to start?
Sure, and this gets to the issue of second chances. I mean, we've talked a lot about giving people a second look. And I want to emphasize that actually there's some great work being done by Kevin, by others. I mean, in 2019 alone, we had 16 jurisdictions introduce legislation. So there's a growing appetite and a growing recognition that this is a political movement. It is a community movement. It is a family movement that has legs and has potential. We now know that we've got more elderly people in prison than any other country in the world. There's actually been a 400% increase in the number of elderly people. The work that Dylan is doing with the ACLU and the work that's being done at the state level can make a huge difference, so that we're no longer running nursing homes and memory care centers in prisons around this country. That is not the place for elderly people. And we know these folks are not a public safety risk. They need to be back in their communities. And we're seeing some brave leadership at the community level that's pushing for that. And so what I would say, especially the folks who are watching today, that work at the local and state level is absolutely critical. That's what's going to change the world in this country, for activists, for community members, for people who are directly impacted, to have a voice in our policies. Because frankly, we built this system with very little thought and very little input from any of the communities that were directly impacted by the criminal justice system. It's really time to change that and to rehumanize and relocate public safety in the community where it actually can make a huge difference, and not behind prison walls where it simply separates us, others us, and frankly swallows up billions of dollars for no good reason. So take hope. There is action in many communities around the country, and hooking up with FAMM and Sentencing Project and the ACLU, national organizations that care what's happening at the local level, you can make a difference. So thank you.
Thanks. April, I'm gonna give you your last word too, but I'm gonna screw this up by asking you to address one thing in particular, which is we see crime, at least the perception that shootings and murders in some of our cities are spiking. So this is a time where, you know, in the past, we're used to playing defense. And so people have to equate this idea that we need bold reform, reducing the prison population. And some people are going to say, I'm watching this on the news and you're telling me I got to let people out of prison. So I mean, we mentioned that a little bit before we started. So I'm hoping you can sort of address why that is not a, you know, an inconsistency, that we can do both of those things.
Absolutely. I think we are at a very critical point in this country when it comes to race and racial reckoning about the system. I agree with Amy that the criminal legal system that we have right now has not been built on evidence-based practices. A lot of what we see and how we got to mass incarceration was from very reckless legislation without full consideration towards the impact that it was going to have, and specifically on Black communities, and now we see on other communities of color. So when we talk about where we are right now with, and I would say too, when we look at our news, we really need to separate out whether or not it is a real trend upward or if it's a very momentary spike. I would really caution us against looking at trends during a national pandemic as a guide to what the future is going to hold. The questions we should be asking in communities that's experiencing violence or upticks in violence at this time is why. We should be asking the questions of what issues are impacting those communities around access to basic human needs and mental health issues that have gone untreated for really long times, and what happens to communities when you cannot have community-based interventions to really deal with conflict, right? So I think this is a moment for us to take a critical look at why, but also to remember that we're at a moment in our history that we've never been at before. So we should be very cautious about allowing people to use these very temporary numbers or upticks to force us back into paths that we know to be very harmful. So what I'll say as my closing remarks is that the issue of reform, whether we're talking about second look or just the end to mass incarceration, if we're having these conversations without addressing race, then we are doing harm to Brown and Black communities, period. I think the days are over for you to have conversations about reforming the criminal legal system without tackling the very uncomfortable and difficult conversations of race. Because I do think the system was built very intentionally based on our historic systemic issues with race in this country. So we have to have those conversations as we deal with reform. And I'm hoping that my colleagues like Amy and Kevin and Dylan at the national organizations will join in with the Black Public Defenders Association and having some very critical conversations around race and the role that it plays in upholding and sustaining a lot of harm that we see being done to communities.
Well, thank you. And thanks for sharing that. And thanks for being here. Dylan, we're running low in time, but let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, super quick. I'll just say to people, and I want to echo what Amy and April said, like, don't get discouraged. I know that we talked a lot today about the problems and about the challenges and about how hard this fight is. The fact that it feels like we may not be making progress is not because our solutions are too small or our ideas aren't bold or we're not fighting enough. It's because the problem is so big. You know, the ACLU's goal in the clemency campaign, and I'll just say for folks who want to learn more about that campaign, aclu.org/clemency. Love to have you check it out and see what we have there. But the fact that, you know, liberating 50,000 people in 5 years, that feels like a big goal. I think that feels like a big number to people. That's less than 5% of the state prison population, right? And it's also a number that's readily achievable if you look at who is in state prisons across the country. So what I want to leave folks with, if anything, is this: please feel hopeful and optimistic about the road ahead. There are amazing people doing this work. You've got 3 of them on this call: Amy, Kevin, and April, and I'm just lucky enough to be here too. There are amazing people doing this work. And yeah, the problem is enormous. It has been generations, to April's point, in the making. You know, the system is doing what it was intended to do in most places in this country. But that is not to say that it cannot be fixed and the problems cannot be solved. We have seen so much progress at the local level. We have seen so many good things happen over the last several years because of the work of advocates at the national and state level, because of the work of impacted families. That will continue, but it is incumbent upon all of us to have Facebook profiles to share the stories and the articles we see about where reform is happening. It's incumbent upon all of us who know folks who work in the system to urge them to use their discretion and power more wisely and more boldly. It's incumbent upon us who are fortunate enough not to have a family member who's incarcerated to lift up the people whose family members are incarcerated, to center their stories and expertise and wisdom in this work. If we keep doing that, we will end mass incarceration in this country forever. It is going to be a long road and a long fight to get there. But if there's anything, again, that I want people to leave with, it is to be hopeful, because the work is going on. The problem is huge, but the solutions are real and they are happening, and they will continue to happen with everyone's support. So thank you, Kevin, for organizing this. And thank you to the team at FAMM for pulling this together.
Well, thank you all again. I'm going to close just by saying part of the reason FAMM wants to be involved in this work, not only because it's so big and important, but because we think this is a place where people have been directly impacted. The stories that we've told over the years to change other laws are going to be even more important here, because you're going to have to see and hear from the people who have served these long sentences, who may have committed the types of offenses that scare you or bother you or offend you, and see that what they did with their second chance. Because there are a lot of examples of people who have gotten out because of clemency or second look or because of compassionate release, and gone on to be productive members of their society and great parents and great family members. And I know of no other way to change hearts and minds than for you to see and hear from those people. So Thursday, during our regular scheduled Heart to Heart series, we're going to have, it's not going to be a panel of experts, it's going to be a panel of people who have served long sentences and who are out. So I encourage you Thursday at 2 to watch that on FAMM's Facebook Live. And I want to thank everybody who joined us here again. Mention, if you are looking to get involved, you can text CHANCE to 21333 or go to famm.org or to any of the groups that are joining us today. And let's get this done. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day.